I am so excited because when they say knowledge is power, like it is so true. Just this study. Like I've always known about insulin, and I've always had a healthy, just a roundabout common knowledge about the value of insulin in the body, and I knew what cortisol was, and its relation to stress. I didn't know how this was all tied together. This is what's blowing me away. This is what's sweeping me off of my feet when I'm really digging in and getting a healthy, deep knowledge, deep understanding. And I know I could go deeper. I know if I was in the medical profession, my knowledge of this stuff would be way more extensive. And it's kind of inspiring me. This is scary. But nonetheless, we are discussing the insulin equation and the battle for blood sugar. And we are in the last part of the series talking about so previously we talked about the relationship between the definition of insulin and the definition of cortisol. We broke that down, right? We discussed what organs produce them in the body. We discussed their role in regards to blood sugar and how they balance blood sugar in the body, and how too much insulin or too much cortisol can affect the body. We talked about in the first, that was the first part of the series. In the second part of the series, we talked about the insulin and glucose relationship. How insulin affects blood sugar, glucose being the scientific name for blood sugar. Glu for the blood, cose meaning sugar. Glucose, and the insulin relationship, how insulin works to lower glucose in the body, and how too much of either of which can affect the body. That's what we talked about in the previous episode. Now, in this last part of the series, we're going to discuss cortisol and its relationship to blood sugar. So we discussed insulin in relationship to blood sugar. Now we're going to discuss cortisol and its relationship to blood sugar. So if you watch the first two parts of this series, you should have a healthy understanding of where this episode is going to go. So without beating a dead horse, let's just get into it and break it on down so it can forever and consistently be broke. Okay. So the relationship between glucose and cortisol is a direct metabolic tug of war. While insulin's job is to lower blood sugar, cortisol's primary mission is to raise it. So remember, insulin is activated in the pancreas next to the stomach when you eat. Cortisol is activated in the adrenal gland next to the kidney when you're under some sort of stress, or when you wake up early in the morning. Okay. Or when you're under some sort of physical stress as well, or if you've lacked sleep, cortisol is heightened. So think of glucose as the currency of your body, and cortisol is the emergency fund manager who liquidates physical assets, i.e. muscle and fat, to put cash, sugar, back into the system for immediate survival. So the cortisol glucose interaction matrix. Let's talk about that. As you can see, I'm getting a lot better with my diagrams. So let's talk about what happens when cortisol is high and blood sugar is high, and when cortisol is high and blood sugar is low. And let's talk about when cortisol is low and blood sugar is high, as well as when cortisol is low and blood sugar is low. All right. So high cortisol, or high stress, and high glucose, or high blood sugar. Remember, high, we refer to high as the prefix hyper, and low as the prefix hypo. Okay. So high cortisol and high blood sugar, high glucose, is the resistance loop. Cortisol blocks insulin signal, making cells deaf to sugar. So if you eat when you're stressed, remember, insulin activates when you're eating. Insulin is meant to keep the blood sugar low, right? So if you eat while you're stressed out, what do you think is going to happen? The cortisol is going to block the insulin, making cells deaf to the sugar, and then the glucose stays high in the blood, leading to visceral belly fat. So if you eat while you're stressed, all of that blood sugar is going to turn into fat and go straight to your belly. Everything you eat is going to go straight to your belly. And the thing about visceral fat, what makes visceral fat so bad, is because there's no amount of sit-ups that can get rid of visceral fat, because visceral fat is the fat around the organs. You can do crunches. You can get a six-pack from doing crunches, but that's the fat under the skin. You see what I'm saying? When you see a person with a six-pack, it's because you're seeing they burned the fat under the skin of the belly. Then they haven't burned the visceral fat, the fat around the organs. So you can have a six-pack and still have a beer belly. This is crazy. It's crazy. Like this series is blowing my mind. and this causes a metabolic syndrome. All right, so now let's talk about when your cortisol is high, when you're under high stress and your blood sugar is low. This is the mobilization state. So the body is under acute stress. The cortisol aggressively mines muscle and fat to dump sugar into the blood for fight or flight. So typically, when your cortisol is high and your blood sugar is low, this is basically the state you should be in when you're working out. You know what I'm saying? When you're working out, or when you're in an extreme case, an acute stress, as it says, right? But you don't always want to be in this state, right? But typically, this is the optimal, as far as if the cortisol is going to be high, this is the optimal position for the cortisol to be in. If your cortisol is high and your blood sugar is low, like when you're working out, you know what I mean? That's why working out is so important, because you activate that blood sugar and you you activate that ketosis. This is when the body naturally begins to produce ketones that naturally burn fat, and this is how you burn that visceral fat around the belly. So now let's talk. So we talked about when cortisol is high and blood sugar is high. When cortisol is high and blood sugar is low. Now let's talk about when cortisol is low. When the stress is low and your blood sugar is high. All right. So this is the storage phase. With low cortisol, insulin easily moves glucose into the cells. This is a calm post-meal state, focused on building tissue and replenishing glycogen. So when you're working out, your cortisol is high and your blood sugar is low. And when you're chilling and when you're fed, you know what I mean, and your pancreas is catching up, right, and your food is digested, this is when your cortisol is low and your blood sugar is high. When your blood sugar is high, the insulin is activated and it's going to do its thing. So you're just chilling out. You know what I mean? Now let's talk about when cortisol is low and blood sugar is low, or glucose is low. Right? This is an energy crisis. The body cannot raise blood sugar when it drops. This leads to extreme fatigue, salt cravings, and crashing after minor stress. So this is when you become irritable and you break a little bit. This is characteristics of adrenal burnout. Yeah, this is burnout, period. Adrenal burnout, forget that. This is burnout, period. Right? Because if your cortisol is low, you're not as sharp as you need to be when stressful situations come about. You see what I'm saying? And this is how the burnout occurs. So you're not as sharp as you need to be, and then you don't have the energy. You know what I'm saying? But your cortisol is low, your blood sugar is low, so now you don't have the energy in your body to keep up with it. You know what I mean? So you're just going to crash altogether. You know what I'm saying? You have no alertness and you have no energy. No, you're unalert and you have no energy. You just crash altogether. You need to just fall back. And this is why sleep is in this particular case, this is why sleep.
When you see somebody who is in really good shape, there are a few conclusions you can draw about that person. 1, they're disciplined and they understand dedication. 2, they are patient and they understand commitment, because we know nothing just happens overnight. So they have to be patient with themselves in the process in order to see results. 3, that person is mentally tough. Life hits us with stress. Our bodies get fatigued. We get sore, but they don't allow that to become an excuse to give up or to become inconsistent. And 4, they have self-love, because we know that anything that you love, you take care of, even down to the point of it being a sacrificial love, because when you love something, you also keep things away from it that could be harmful, like being gluttonous or alcohol consumption, etc. So when you see somebody who is in really good shape, you're not merely just observing something physical, but it's indicative that there are a lot of other good character traits underlying.
Is so important, because this is how the body, when you rest and when you sleep, the body is beginning to regulate itself and recharge the battery, i.e. blood sugar. It's balancing, it's recalibrating the blood sugar in your body when you rest and when you sleep. I promise you, I did not know this before researching for this series, and and I'm so glad I did. This is like revolutionizing for me. So yes, this is what happens when. This is how cortisol, this is the relationship, the matrix of the relationship between cortisol and the blood sugar in your body. Now let's talk about the 3 ways cortisol forces glucose. I was about to say glucosol. Let's talk about the 3 ways that cortisol forces glucose up. So cortisol is technically an insulin antagonist. Cortisol is an insulin antagonist. Remember, this is not a battle for supremacy, it's a battle for balance. It uses 3 specific mechanisms to ensure your brain has fuel during a crisis. Gluconeogenesis, making new sugar. Cortisol signals the liver to manufacture glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, primarily breaking down muscle protein. So the liver takes protein from your muscles to create extra blood sugar and glycerol from fat. So it takes this isn't necessarily the healthiest. So when you're under high stress, your muscles and your fat break down. So you're burning fat, but you're burning fat in an unhealthy way, because you're burning fat and you're raising your blood sugar, right? This is gluconeogenesis. So this is what happens when your cortisol is too high. Cortisol signals the liver to manufacture glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, primarily breaking down muscle protein and glycerol from fat. That's crazy. So that's gluconeogenesis, the making of new sugar. Glycogenolysis, the quick release. It triggers the liver to break down its stored starch, glycogen, and flood the bloodstream with immediate sugar. Yeah, so basically, once again, this is how cortisol raises your blood sugar and causes diabetes. Pretty much, this is how high stress raises your blood sugar. High stress raises your blood sugar and blood pressure. So it's like that's probably a whole nother series. We're talking about blood pressure, but let's get into blood sugar though. We want to talk about blood sugar right now, and then the insulin blockade. This is to ensure the brain gets sugar first. Cortisol temporarily blocks insulin receptors in your muscles and your skin. This is stress-induced insulin resistance. So when you have high anxiety, you begin to get very flabby and your body starts to break down. This is what happens when you have high anxiety. You get under a whole lot of stress. You can't build a whole lot of muscle because the cortisol hormone in your body is pretty high and it's blocking the insulin in your stomach. So anything you eat is going straight to your brain because you're worried all the time and you're thinking and you're stressed out. You know what I mean? This is real, guys. This is this isn't just hocus pocus abracadabra. Like this is like simple building blocks. You know what I'm saying? 1 + 1. You know what I mean? It's crazy. So now, what happens when there is chronic stress? This is when you're repeatedly being stressed out over time. Let's look into what happens. In a natural state, a drop in glucose triggers a rise in cortisol to bring it back up. So if you haven't eaten, that cortisol rises, and now you're more alert and you're hungry and you're looking for food, right? That's the purpose of cortisol, is to keep you on your toes, right? So it's a protective mechanism. However, in the modern world, chronic stress keeps cortisol high 24/7. So this is the dangerous cycle. So step 1, stress spikes cortisol. Step 2, cortisol spikes blood glucose or blood sugar if you haven't eaten. Step 3, insulin rises to manage the glucose. Let's say you're starved or you're stressed out and your blood sugar is high. Insulin is supposed to lower the blood sugar, so the insulin rises to activate, right? The insulin is activated but step 4, because you aren't physically fighting or fleeing, the insulin shunts that extra glucose into visceral fat storage, which visceral fat being the fat around the organs, the fat under the skin of the belly. You know what I mean? So as you see in the diagram, the people with the 6-packs, they burn the subcutaneous fat, the fat under the skin. But you have to have that hormonal balance in order to burn the visceral fat. You have to go through that ketosis phase and have that low blood sugar and low insulin in order to go into ketosis to burn that visceral fat. This is very key. It's very, very key. So this is a hormonal triangle. So cortisol drives glucose up, glucose drives insulin up, insulin drives glucose down, and cortisol fights insulin's effect the entire time. You see what I mean? So yeah, and it's really that simple. It's really that simple. Cortisol being stressed out. You can't. If you've ever been stressed out chronically, repeatedly over a long period of time, I'm pretty sure you're well aware of how it affects your body. I remember I remember being stressed out a lot throughout my 20s and 30s. And I was a pretty in shape guy. But the shape that I could have been in was nowhere near the shape that I was in. You know what I mean? And I've lived in many different aspects of life. And I had no clue. Had I had this research in my 20s and 30s, my life would have looked entirely different, because I would have been so much more mindful of my eating habits, my sleeping habits, and my lifestyle habits. You know what I mean? Just the people in my life, You know, the romantic partners I had in the past. You know, all these things that were so triggering and troublesome to me. Just even family. A lot of people. You know, family is human too. You know, and humans are gonna human. You know, and you know they can be just as stressful as anything else in life. You know, not everybody. You know, healthy family is a luxury. Healthy family is a blessing. Healthy family, like, anyway, I don't want to preach. I don't want to get too off topic, but you know, the effects of cortisol, you know, stress and how it battles with insulin. You know, the spiking and the dipping and had I known these things, oh my God, where would my life be? And I can do nothing short of just preach the gospel and tell people what I wish somebody would have told me. That kind of sums up why I do almost everything I do with this brand. You know, because if somebody would have just told me, oh my gosh, the wonders that it would do for me. You know, people look to religion, they look to all these sorts of you know, gimmicks and tricks and so on and so forth. And you know, everything you need is right in front of you. Everything you need is right under your nose. You know, God is in the textbooks. God is in science. God is in medicine. God is in biology. I promise you he is. Because listen, yeah. And so those who have ears will listen. Those who have ears will listen. And I'm just going to leave it at that. I love you. I don't know you, but I love you because I love me. And that's it.